Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I'm joined here by someone else as well. What's your name?
I am McLovin.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of film. I talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film off the ground. Now, I cover 2 films in each episode of Film Stories. I'm just going to get on with the first of them now. I'm going fairly recent at the point this is recorded anyway, and I'm going to delve into a little bit of horror. Let me play you a clip from a trailer. I'm going to come to the story of this particular film the other side of this.
Oh, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah.
This is 476 Barbarian, right?
Yeah, I'm renting this place.
No, I booked it a month ago.
Are you sure you have the right place?
Yeah. What am I supposed to do?
Why don't you come inside and we'll call these idiots. Why don't you just crash here?
Oh, no.
I don't know if you got a great look at this neighborhood, but I don't think you should be out there by yourself. It's dry and there's a lock on the door. By the way, I'm Keith.
Tess.
You take the bedroom and I'll sleep out here on the couch.
God.
So that is a clip from the trailer of 2022's Barbarian, written and directed by Zach Cregger and starring Georgina Campbell, Bill Skarsgård and Justin Long in the lead roles of the film. Now, Barbarian's story, well, let's go back to Zach Cregger because he's inevitably key to this. And he started the 2000s as part of a comedy troupe that was going by the name of WKUK. Performing in the US, the group achieved a fair amount of fame as well, not least landing a television show, The Whitest Kids You Know, which ran for several series. But his move towards film came in 2008, where he appeared in a film called College in an acting capacity. And a year later, he was co-directing a higher profile release called Miss March. Now, Miss March didn't do well. It wasn't critically well received. It wasn't commercially well received. And Cregger's film career was kind of stalling, certainly on a directing basis, stalling before it had really got off the ground. Now, it didn't stop him in 2011 co-directing The Civil War on Drugs. But again, that failed to cut through, and he found himself going back to acting. He wasn't getting directing work. That wasn't happening. So he did some acting gigs, primarily on television as well, but he was still some way away from becoming a hugely sought-after film director. Now, he had also been reading a book by a man called Gavin de Becker, a man whose background was in the security industry, and he wrote a book called The Gift of Fear. Now, The Gift of Fear took off, hugely successful, and as Cregger told the website As the Bunny Hops, that's the name of the website, he said there was a chapter in the book that was really primarily directed towards women, and he was encouraging women to pay attention to these little minor red flags that men can give off in day-to-day situations. And these were tiny flags that Cregger, as a man, hadn't seen, hadn't really thought of before. He realised as he was reading the book that there was a list of considerations there that he hadn't had to deal with in his day-to-day life. And it inspired him to get writing. And so he would write the first scene for a film, which he would then gradually build it up a little bit more and more. But he would explain, I didn't want to write a movie, I just wanted to write a scene where I could load as many of those little tiny red flags into an interaction as possible. And he described this as an exercise for me to do late at night in my garage. There are other things you can do late at night in a garage, but writing a movie seemed like the appropriate way forward. And so what Cregger was doing was he was penning scenes set in an Airbnb, and an Airbnb that turned out to be double booked. And he loaded those scenes with the triggers that he was talking about. Now, it was some time before he built this out towards more of a feature script, but a screenplay for the film Barbarian, as it would become known, was taking shape. However, Cregger, as a fan of horror, he didn't really want to go down the predictable side of things, and he was very, very conscious that once you set off on certain story arcs in horror films, you can pretty much see where they're going fairly early on in the film. He didn't want that to be the case in his movie. I'm not going to spoiler heavy in this podcast. I will just say it is absolutely not the case in his movie. He was willing to do things to the screenplay to make the film far more unpredictable. Although in turn, when it came time to take the screenplay to market, that would make it a tougher thing just to try and sell and get people interested in. After all, film studios like their things to be relatively predictable, relatively cookie cutter. And Cregger was just taking some gambles really with the formula and the audience expectation of a film of this ilk. Now, those who have seen the film will kind of know what I'm getting at here, but Cregger knew what direction he was going, and he was writing his script late at night. He was working away in his garage, hope he had the heating on, but he was also very conscious that he was, in his words, direct to jail in Hollywood terms, that because his films where he had directed hadn't been a hit, he wasn't able to get something off the ground himself, certainly not with him attached to direct it. And so he got to the point with Barbarian that instead he just started sending the script out to financiers, and, well, the rejections soon started piling up. Now, he explained his approach to Vulture, and he talked about, his words, I made a spreadsheet of every production company that had made a horror movie in the last 15 years, and I sent it out to all of them. And every one of them, Cregger said no. Every single one. And he explained why. He said they didn't like that the movie does something on page 50. They didn't like that there's a character who's part of Hollywood. They said that nobody wants to follow a certain type of character, I'm just redacting slightly, for 30 pages. And he said all of these things that people were picking on, especially the lack of a structure, were the things that excited me the most. These were his lines. This was the stuff that was really important to him, that he didn't want to sacrifice. And if people were coming to him and saying, you might want to think about changing that, well, what was the point? That wasn't the film that he'd envisaged. That wasn't the film he was looking to make. And he said, I knew that if I were to polish those edges, I would be compromising this thing and defanging it before it had a chance. And he kind of realised when everyone was turning it down, because it wasn't going to be an expensive film to make. It wasn't written as an expensive film to make either. But with everyone turning it down, he kind of felt, well, the only way I'm going to get this made is if I find the financing myself. And so he seriously considered going into heavy debt in order to pay to get the film made. He looked at one stage as well at selling his house. But then separately, there was a relatively tiny outfit called Boulder Light Pictures, headed up by two people, J.D. Lifshitz and Rafael Margules. And out of the blue, they got in touch. They'd seen his script and they'd enjoyed some success with horror. They'd had a profitable hit, for instance, with the film Becky. And they looked at this script, and the things that they were responding to in the screenplay were the things that everyone else wasn't responding to. Boulder Light Pictures wanted this film not just because it was so odd. Now, the beauty here was that Boulder Lights, one of Boulder Lights' founders, J.D. Lifshitz, had a contacts book and a half, namely a producer by the name of Roy Lee. Now, Roy Lee also had a fair few hit movies under his belt. Look at the movies that he's been part of. The Lego Movie, for instance. And also, in terms of horror, It Chapter 1 and It Chapter 2. He was one of the producers on those particular films. And so what happened was that Lifshitz got in touch with Roy Lee and just said, I've got this script that I really think you should see. I really like the script. And Lee took a look at it and said, yeah, he absolutely loved the script as well. But also he realised that his own company had turned it down a year prior. It was one of those that Cregger had initially sent the screenplay to as part of his initial blitz and had sent a rejection in return. And so, out of the blue, Roy Lee decided to call Zach Cregger. And Cregger took the call, and Lee explained that his production company, Vertigo, was really interested in making Barbarian. And this should have been the best news in the world for Zach Cregger, who'd been trying to direct another film for many years. And as he relayed to Vulture, he said, Roy, I've been trying to get this movie into someone's hands like yours forever, but I just signed with these guys at Boulder Light and I can't bail. There was a line for him. There was no way that he was going to let down the people who had taken a gamble on his film. Roy Lee let him off the hook. He just said, no, it's them who gave me the money and I want to make it with them. So Boulder Light were in. Roy Lee and his Vulture label were also in. And as Zach Cregger said, from that moment, with Roy Lee on board, we were off to the races. Well, sort of off to the races, because they had a producer now. Cregger was going to direct and refine the script. They still had no one to pay for it. You still had to take it out to a whole bunch of studios to see if they'd give it a go. And once again, the answers were coming back in the negative. I mean, A24, for instance, it was a fairly quick no. Neon, which was enjoying a lot of returns from the success of Parasite, for instance, it had a good look at Barbarian, but in the end it declined to press forward with the film. And in the end, the budget for it it was pegged at $3.5 million. Like a lot of horror films from relatively new filmmakers, the price was not exorbitant, but then also the expectation wasn't exorbitant. This isn't going to burn the box office up. For every horror film that just goes nuclear at the box office, there's 100 that just go straight onto a video on demand service. And so, in the end, the way that they got the money together was primarily outside of America. That there's a company called Logical Pictures in France that was deciding to put in the lion's share of the film. Now, Roy Lee then put in a call to Bill Skarsgård, who played Pennywise in his It films, and asked him to lend his name both as a star of the film and also as an executive producer. And by early 2021, finally, it looked like Barbarian was getting ready to go. The casting had come together, for instance, as well as Skarsgård. Georgina Campbell had been cast in the lead role. There's not a lot of speaking parts in the film as well, so it wasn't an exhaustive casting effort required. Cregger was going to take a cameo. But then there was this part of Kale, a character that has, a particularly memorable character in the film. And this was one where Zach Cregger was thinking big. He had Zac Efron in mind for it. And Zac Efron isn't averse to taking on a darker role. And so as Cregger explained to Screen Rant, he just said, I wrote to him and we offered it initially to Zac Efron because I was thinking I want to go for some beefcake kind of himbo. That's not me. So he said no diss on Zac Efron, but that's the way that he's portrayed himself a lot. And he said, I was just thinking jawbone, biceps and a haircut. And then Efron took a look at it and turned the film down. And so he, as much as Cregger wanted him to do the film, it was a no-go. But then he kind of looked at the character again and just thought, well, perhaps he should be something more of a likeable everyman. Maybe that's the way forward with him. And it almost like a bit of a Tom Hanks kind of figure in the part. And what Cregger did was he turned his attention to Justin Long, because in his words, he just felt that Justin Long had a really warm presence, and that kind of warm presence would really help get this particular character across to audiences. Now, Justin Long, who's dabbled in horror anyway, I mean, he's in Kevin Smith's film Tusk, if you ever particularly want to dig that one out, he warmed to this and signed on the dotted line. And so filming was all set to get underway in the spring of 2021. It was built, it was ready to go, and then disaster struck. And a tragedy, really. Eric Tavishian, the main financier of Barbarian, passed away after an illness. And I mean, clearly the filmmakers were gutted about this, but then also they had to get practical about it fairly quickly because the shoot was about to begin. And if the other financiers worked out that the main money had suddenly disappeared, well, they might pull out as well. And the whole film just was on the verge potentially of collapse. So what could you do? Well, the first thing they had to do was let the crew go. They couldn't afford to pay them. The money had gone. And this is where Roy Lee, though, he came to the rescue once more because he put in a call to someone who happened to be in his phone, a man called Michael Schaefer. Now, Michael Schaefer is the president of production company New Regency. And, what was described as an emergency deal was quickly struck to prop the film back up. Now, what this meant was that New Regency was going to come in and plug the financing gap. And this deal was done, about 24 hours after the film looked like it had basically died. Now, though, it wasn't just back live and kicking. The film had an extra $1 million on the budget because, as Michael Schaefer reconciled, you're not going to be able to do the film for $3.5 million. You're going to ask me for this money anyway at some point. I'd rather give it you now. It will save you coming back and ask the question. But that 24 hours had been busy. It's worth noting that. The crew had been let go, and then all of a sudden, within 24 hours, they had to get back in touch with the crew and had to rehire them all. And a lot of money had also been set on sets and building the necessary street that they required for the film. And as filming began, this suburban American tale was taking shape here around the city of Sofia in Bulgaria. That's where they did the vast bulk of the filming for Barbarian, and this required the production to build an American street just in the Sofia area, just outside of the city, that they could shoot on. Now, what they then did was, because the film is set in Detroit in the US, they went back to America and did some exterior shots just to give them the actual flavour of Detroit to it. But this was primarily on a set that was built in Bulgaria. It's a relatively swift shoot as well. And once completed, it was a matter of Cregger taking the film into the editing room with the expectation that Barbarian was a film that was going to head off towards a streaming service. That seemed like the likely home for it. In fact, there was a streaming service fairly quickly in mind as well, because the New Regency deal to help fund the film brought with it a link into Disney. The reason for this was, historically, New Regency had had a hookup with 20th Century Fox, and Fox was distributing the bulk of New Regency's movies. But of course, Fox had been bought up by Disney, and now 20th Century Fox, or what's left of it, goes under the label 20th Century Studios, and the deal with New Regency was still in place. Now, what this meant was that New Regency took Barbarian because, effectively, 20th Century Studios had first refusal on the film and was sufficiently impressed with it as well. Here was a low budget horror movie that really had something to it as well. And so whilst the talk was still that this has got streaming written all over it, Disney had a streaming service. It still has Disney Plus. When it stopped deleting things off it, it's still got Disney Plus. It's still investing an awful lot of money in it, and this is just the kind of production that could sit quite nicely on there as well. Now, the thing that turned this was test screenings, and we've seen this with a Paramount feature this year as well, Smile, where now Smile was all set to go to streaming until the test screenings kicked in. We've also seen it with Rob Savage's new film, The Boogeyman, that originally intended for streaming, then a test screen just started to go nuclear. Exactly the same case with Barbarian, which was one of those that really went first with this, that they tested it and the response was absolutely nuts. And so 20th Century Studios decided to gamble, decided that we're going to put this into a cinema and we'll see how it goes. And so it built things up very much with that in mind. Now, it changed release date just a couple of times, but it was quite granular changes of release. It was originally scheduled for August the 12th of 2022, then it moved to August the 31st, then it moved to September the 9th. But right the way through, Disney had decided that this was going to a cinema screen, and to its considerable credit, it was willing to go really quite off-piste in the way that it approached the film. that through Disney and through 20th Century Studios, they don't put out an awful lot of films theatrically at the moment. So they tend to be relatively big releases, but not here. And Cregger has been very upbeat about the way that Disney dealt with the film, as has Raphael Margulies, who said to Vulture, credit to Disney, because they really had a lot to do with this movie's success. And they completely understood from the beginning how to market this thing. And the crucial thing here is they talked about how they want this movie to feel like a discovery. They implanted that sense of creating something in the audience. So there was a point, the test of this really was putting a trailer out for the film. Cregger had a go at cutting a trailer, wasn't having an awful lot of joy with it. And the trailer only came out just a couple of months before the film made it to cinemas anyway. But as he explained to Coming Soon, there was a real push to keep a lot of the film under wraps, but particularly in the trailer as well, uncharacteristically so. But he said there was never an argument. He said from the first conversation about the trailer, it was important to them, just like it was for me, to protect the movie and to protect the experience of seeing it for the first time. And Barbarian is no spoiler to say it is a film with its fair share of secrets, but the fact that so much of the promotion kept them under wraps is remarkable in the modern era. Now, Disney showed the film for the first time at San Diego Comic-Con in 2022, that it put on a screening on July the 22nd to get really just some kind of gauge for it from audiences. And the response to it was really strong, really strong. I mean, particularly in the genre of horror, where there tends to be quite a lot of snootiness, that this was being praised for doing things slightly differently and also still actually working as something that's really quite scary. Now, I should note the film takes some swings that not everybody will be on board with. And in fact, a lot of the criticism that the film did attract was over the fact that it went off in a fairly unconventional way at a fairly unexpected moment. But again, I don't really want to go into that because we start to head into spoiler territory. And part of the joy of Barbarian is discovering Barbarian. That was certainly the case on its opening weekend in American cinemas as well, that it opened the weekend of September the 9th to the 11th in the US, and this modestly costed horror movie opened in first place. Now, it should be noted that the box office in the summer of 2022 was still regarded as a little bit suppressed, assuming your film wasn't called Minions: The Rise of Gru or Top Gun: Maverick. But still, films were breaking out. I mean, you look at Sony's movie Bullet Train, for instance, just that was at $90 million in third place the weekend that Barbarian opened. Barbarian's first weekend gross of $10.5 million, by most conventional standards, might not be seen as that remarkable. But for the purposes of this film, it was really seen as a result, and rightly so as well, that its production budget was half of that. This was a production that wasn't even going to be near a cinema at one stage in its life, and here it was, topping the box office. But crucially for 20th Century Studios, its word of mouth was really strong as well. And so the following week, horror has a habit of dropping 60-70% in its second weekend on release. Barbarian dropped by 38%. Its second weekend gross, it held in second place as The Woman King opened in first. Pearl came along in third place. See How They Run was in fourth. But it was very clear that Barbarian was punching above its initial weight. Now, it didn't set the world alight at the box office, but the $40 million return that it ultimately brought in American cinemas was comfortable and pleasing to Disney, which had a plan to fast track this really to its Disney Plus streaming service. At the end of last year, at the point we're recording, did this with a few films. It did it with The Banshees of Inisherin, for instance, although the director of that film, Martin Madonna, told Roger Ebert's podcast that he managed to get a 2-month window of exclusivity in cinemas out of Disney. Likewise, Mark Mylod's The Menu, that went fairly quickly to Disney+, as did Barbarian as well. It was released on the service just before Christmas of 2022, and the word of mouth just continued to spread as well, that the response on streaming was nuts. that it started its streaming release in the US, for instance, at the end of October, and the word of mouth continued to snowball. We got it on Disney Plus in December of 2022, and by that point it was clear that this was a word of mouth hit, not just theatrically but also on the Disney streaming platform. At least here in the US, its streaming platform it's played on has varied depending where you happen to be in the world. And as Cregger would reflect to Coming Soon, he said, "We thought this was going to be a movie that was going to go straight to video on demand somewhere." He explained that the best case scenario for me was that I hope somebody likes it enough to take a runner on me to make another movie one day. That's all. That's the only metric of success I could imagine. And then, as he added, for it to have this wide theatrical release and for people to like it and critics like it and word of mouth, a film without a huge press campaign, he was taken aback. He wasn't just taken aback either, he was very suddenly in demand, because movie studios like horror creators who can make films on modest budgets that make a profit. And in particular, studios were fighting over talent towards the end of 2022. I mean, M. Night Shyamalan has upped sticks and taken his production deal from Universal to Warner Brothers, for instance. Now, Jason Blum and James Wan have now unified their production companies, and it means that James Wan had left Warner Brothers. And so New Line Cinema, Warner Brothers' parent company, snapped up Zach Cregger on a multi-picture deal, almost with a kind of Jason Blum style feel to what they've asked him to do. That Cregger he's got his wish. He is going to be directing a new film. At the point of this recording, he's committed to making the film Weapons, that's got Pedro Pascal attached to star. He's also overseeing a science fiction film called Companion, and it's the model of the budgets are kept relatively low, you keep creative control over your projects, and the studios get a relatively modestly costed pipeline of movies that some may go theatrical, some may go to the streaming service, but either way, they're not really going to lose. With Barbarian, it firmly has broken not just Zach Cregger out of movie jail, but it's thrown him up the higher echelons of Hollywood talent, of the kind of filmmakers that Hollywood studios want to work with, to the point where, after years and years and years of being stuck, he suddenly found himself incredibly in demand. It's not even his first film as director either. It's taken several films to get to this point. At the point this is recording, he sat in his early 40s, finally with an international success under his name. And the beauty of it as well is that the way that Barbarian has been discussed and being talked about, word of mouth is out there, but it's not spoiling the film. And if I had one recommendation to leave you with of this particular part of the podcast, it's don't let anyone spoil it. Go and take a look, because someone really has taken a risk here. The risk, thankfully, has paid off. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. And as always, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. You're in the bit where I do some parish notices now and tell you other bits and bobs that we're kind of up to. So first and foremost, if you like this podcast and wouldn't mind supporting it, there are three main ways that you can do so. If you want to support us financially, head over to patreon.com/Simon Brew. And if you put some money in the pot there, then you're not only supporting the podcast, but you get in return the podcast early pretty much every week. You also get it ad-free, and you also find the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes and the assorted projects that we're working with. Then, costing you absolutely nothing is leaving, ideally, a hugely positive review of the podcast. Some people have got the wrong idea about that. We've had a lot of not so positive reviews of late. If you would be kind enough to go and spread the word in a positive way, that would be massively appreciated. Likewise, if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the podcast at your podcast home of choice, things like that really help independent podcasts such as this, and it's much, much appreciated. We're also shipping out now the two latest issues of our print magazine. So we've got Film Stories magazine that's leading on the film Greatest Days. That is 100 pages every issue, filled with new film writing. We're really, really proud of it. And we're hugely proud too of Film Junior, which we think is the only regular print film magazine for under 15s in the world, and is also primarily written by under 15s. We're talking about Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse in there. We've got young reporters interviewing filmmakers, and the aim is to make a film magazine for youngsters that they can also take part in. Any support on those is hugely appreciated. I just want to give a quick plug too as well for the inaugural UK Independent Podcast Awards. If you are a podcaster who's not part of a big company and want to put your name forward for that, if you go to independentpodcastawards.com, you'll find all the details there. But now, I think that's enough parish notices. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. I'm going back to the 2000s for this. We're going to do a bit of comedy. I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer. Come to the story, the other side of this.
Tonight is our last party as high school people. You know when you hear girls saying like, oh, I was so gone last night, I shouldn't have slept with that guy. We could be that mistake.
Engage.
Hey, Becca.
Late?
I love you. I love you.
Why don't we say that every day? Why can't we say it more often?
I just want to go to the rooftops and scream, I love my best friend Evan. Boop. You're like the coolest person that's ever talked to me, and I blew it.
Come on, you didn't blow it. I think maybe...
That is bona fide badass.
And that is a clip from 2007's Superbad, directed by Greg Mottola and written by Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. The cast led by Jonah Hill, Michael Cera, Seth Rogen and Bill Hader. And the story of Superbad goes back to the friendship between Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg, who became friends at high school and were writing things together as early as 13 years old. And as Rogen explained to Indie London, he said, myself and Evan started writing what became Superbad in high school when we were 14. And a lot of the stuff in the film actually happened to them. And now they were at school together, and this is one of the first projects that they did together, and it sat on the stove for a little while, inevitably. But they put together a script where the two lead characters were called Seth and Evan, drew on a lot of autobiographical elements of going through high school, and even the names of the other characters in the film turned out to be people that they were at high school with. And as the press notes of Superbad noted, after watching movies they felt weren't accurate or even funny portrayals of high school life, Rogen and Goldberg decided to give it a try themselves. Well, they gave it a try, but they didn't get very far for quite a while. The version of Superbad they wrote when they were 14 years old didn't get made. Spoilers. And it would take an awful lot of drafts, really, before they got anywhere. Goldberg would reveal in an interview that it was 18 drafts of the script before they could interest a studio. But they were slowly building up currency for themselves as writers anyway. That Rogen had broken through in an acting capacity in the TV show Freaks and Geeks. And then Goldberg and Rogen were landing a job writing the Ali G show in the US as well. They were plotting several films. And at the start of his 20s, there was a version of Superbad that Rogen was looking to make where he would play one of the lead roles in it himself. As he would describe to About.com, he said, we had a meeting with this independent film company that was going to make the movie. And he described how at that point I still thought I could play the character. I remember before the meeting just like really shaving. I hadn't shaved in a long time. I remember really like shaving thoroughly. I'm quoting directly here. And I remember looking at my clothes and saying, well, what t-shirt makes me look young? And that was the moment where Rogen realised that this might just have passed him by, that he wasn't young enough. He certainly wasn't looking young enough to play a 17-year-old at high school anymore. And he said, the fact I'm having to put that much thought into looking young means I do not look young. And he said, I remember thinking that means it's over. And this was when he was in his early 20s. But it was that TV show Freaks and Geeks which was the crucial turning point in the journey of Superbad. That as much as Rogen and Goldberg had written a screenplay for it before Rogen landed his role on Freaks and Geeks, it was that show, a hugely loved show cancelled way too soon, that brought him into the world of producer, director and writer Judd Apatow. Now, Apatow created Freaks and Geeks with Paul Feig, and Rogen was given his acting break on it. But then Apatow gave him a writing break as well on his follow-up television project, Undeclared, which was similarly ill-fated as Freaks and Geeks. That too was truncated after just one season. But as Apatow said, at some point during the making of Undeclared, Seth Rogen said to me, "I wrote a script with my friend Evan from Canada. It's called Superbad, and will you read it?" And Judd Apatow said, "Yeah, I'll have a look at that." He took a look at the script and he just said, "I thought it was hilarious, but there weren't any other movies like it out there." Now, on the one hand, that's a good thing. You've got a way in. You're doing something someone else isn't doing. The flip side of it is, as we've discussed with Barbarian, studios tend to like things that are already out there because they're safe and can be sold. And so Apatow saw the potential in this, but also knew it needed work. And in particular, what he suggested was going back to what he described as the emotional heart of the film and beefing that up to make sure it worked. That the humour was working, that was working fine, but just get the emotional side of it to just get in tandem with it, really, and then they would have a film they could move forward with. Now, what helped as well is that Judd Apatow's reputation was growing in the early 2000s, that films like The 40-Year-Old Virgin, for instance, in which Seth Rogen has a part in that, had gone very, very strongly at the box office, and that had got lots of people interested in making more films with him. He was putting together a film at the time called Knocked Up that I covered in a previous episode of Film Stories. He would ultimately cast Seth Rogen in the co-lead role of that. And then Superbad looked like it was moving, that Apatow got to a point where he was going to be able to set this up with a studio, and he already had a director in mind as well. Now, I'm a huge fan of the film Adventureland, directed by Greg Mottola. It's not talked about an awful lot. I do hugely recommend seeking that out. But Mottola was already on Judd Apatow's radar because he directed the first 5 episodes of that TV series Undeclared. And so he decided, sent in the script, let's see what he thinks. And as Mottola remembered, he just said, "I was in a cafe with my wife in Brooklyn, where I live." He said he was procrastinating because I was supposed to be writing a script. His phone rang and it was Judd Apatow. And he just said, "Hey, Greg, it's Judd. Remember Superbad? Do you want to do it?" And so, as Mottola said, I tend to be long-winded, so I started to say, "Well, actually, it's one of the few scripts I read." And Judd was, "Yeah, fine, okay, I'll call you in a week. We're making it." Now, Mottola wasn't lying. He had read the script years before. It had done the rounds, but it needed someone to get it over the line, and Judd Apatow was the person with the power, really, to get that done. He got it set up with Sony. The film was moving forward, and Mottola liked the script, and so he was quickly on board once the offer had come in, and so they could cast the thing now. Now, the initial starting point for the casting was, well, the 2 characters were effectively ciphers for Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg. They were the 2 lead characters in the film. And so the offer, do either of you 2 want to be in it? Well, Evan Goldberg didn't want to be in front of the camera. He declined the opportunity to do that. And Seth Rogen just figured he's just simply too old to play himself in the film. And so he ducked out of that. Now, while Mottola was looking for people to feature in the film, Apatow was now shooting Knocked Up, and he discovered a young talent in that film by the name of Jonah Hill. And as Hill described, he said, "Judd just looked at me and said, 'How young can you play?'" Now, Jonah Hill was in his early 20s at this point, and he just said, "I don't know, 17 or something." And so Apatow asked Jonah Hill if he was interested in playing the lead role in Superbad. And so what happened is Jonah Hill shot a tape of himself in the role of Seth. Apatow then sent that tape over to Greg Mottola and also to the head of Sony, and it was as simple as that. In the end, that they looked at it and just thought, yeah, he is exactly right. He has got this particular role. The audition won them over very, very quickly. Even though he was only like a couple of years younger than Seth Rogen, he was clearly going to be able to play 17 a lot more comfortably. Now, he wasn't the first person to be cast. Michael Cera was the first on the call sheet. Now, in that particular case, Mottola had experience directing him on the Arrested Development TV show as well. And so he knew of him. And even though not everyone on the filmmaking team was as aware of his work, it didn't take long to win them over. And he was cast in the other lead role of the film. Now, the real find of the movie was Christopher Mintz-Plasse, who had never acted in a movie at any point to that stage. Now, he was found for the role of the person who ultimately becomes McLovin in the film. If you've seen the film, you know who he is. And it was down to casting director Alison Jones, who found him a bit of a needle in a haystack, that Alison Jones had worked with Judd Apatow for a long time, and she created a MySpace profile. Do you remember MySpace? And what she did is, via that profile, she asked kids basically to send in their own videos to put themselves forward for the film. One of the people who did so was Christopher Mintz-Plasse, and he was brought in amongst I think 4,000 people came forward for it. He went through to the final stages. He was down to the last 8, actually, and he was the 8th person to be seen. And it was pretty clear he was nailing it, and he had landed his film debut role in a relatively high-profile Hollywood comedy. Emma Stone, meanwhile, had done several auditions for Alison Jones across a variety of projects and hadn't managed to secure one of the roles to that point. But she got a call from Jones, who'd remembered her and asked her to come in, do an audition opposite Jonah Hill, and she was added to the Superbad ensemble. And then also joining was Bill Hader, and the key cast was pretty much fleshed out at that point. Now, what they did was they brought them together nice and early for a few weeks before filming got underway so that they could all get a little bit closer and become more familiar with each other. Now, Michael Cera and Jonah Hill very quickly got on, but also they kind of knew each other. As Sarah said, it's like we did a lot of rehearsals and read-throughs before shooting. Jonah and I hung out a lot, and he said it's kind of funny the way they were trying to plan these hangout dates for us when we were already hanging out. I mean, if Seth Rogen would talk about About.com, it wasn't a difficult process. This wasn't a kind of an apocalypse now thing, bringing everyone together. People got on fairly quickly and amiably. There was a table read as well that went really, really well. And it got to the stage where Superbad, after a 7-8 year journey just to get to this point, could finally go before the cameras. Budgeted at just shy of $20 million, the shoot began in the autumn of 2006. It filmed in and around the Los Angeles area. And as Jonah Hill told the Orlando Sentinel, I actually moved back in with my parents while we shot the movie. Michael Cera as well, is just like, he went into his process a little bit, telling the Sentinel that these clothes you see me wearing in the movie, my real clothes half the time. He explained too that his voice was pretty much as it was during school as well, so it'd be fair to say they were really particularly getting into roles that they knew very well. Now, one of the challenges on set was the level of swearing. That, as Judd Apatow would tell Entertainment Weekly, it was really hard to get Jonah to stop saying cluck, I think that says. He said we spent so much time trying to thin out the clucks. It was like, what, cluck is not connected to a joke. And so Jonah Hill explained that Judd Apatow sent him an email during shooting. He said you should try not to curse so much because you need to make it emphasize more when you do curse. And so Jonah Hill replied to the email, cluck that. Michael Cera would say to Entertainment Weekly as well that it was never a conscious effort to swear on Superbad. He said, if anything, when we were doing the cleaner version for TV, it was a conscious effort not to swear, but they were just swearing. They were swearing like troopers, and a lot of that makes it into the final cut of the film. Now, Christopher Mintz-Plasse was just 17 at the time that he shot Superbad, so he was the only one left really who was still taking tutoring while he was shooting the movie. But there was a scene in the film. If you've seen the movie, you'll know it, which you could say it involved some degree of what you could politely call, well, let's go with fruitiness. Fruitiness works. And what that meant, because he was 17 and shooting a fruity scene, he had to have a chaperone on set. He had to bring his mum on set, as it turned out, for that day. In his first movie, playing this character, having been acting since he was 7, he told The Guardian that it was really awkward, but it worked out okay because his mum was there while the fruity scene was shot. And he said, when I watched the movie with her, the fruity scene wasn't awkward because she'd been right there when it happened. He said afterwards, we didn't talk about it. We still don't speak about that moment. Now, Mottola was really willing to get his improvisation on the film as well, and he could keep the camera running to allow for that too. that they were shooting on high definition digital cameras, and as Jonah Hill said, it was the greatest thing ever. He just said, I literally thought it was the greatest thing. You could just shoot all day. It was awesome, he said. He said it wasn't a waste of money or time to shoot it. He said even if it was crazy, like so much stuff in the movie that they would be shooting, that they were able to keep going. And obviously, by the time it came to the final cut, Greg Mottola took a lot of it out, and he said there were like in-between takes and stuff, or reactions of things hanging out. And he just said we could just keep shooting, and the tapes of the shooting were lasting up to about an hour at a time once they fully got into improvisation. The film wrapped up in 2006. Knocked Up had gone on to be a huge hit at this stage as well. And Superbad went before test audiences with some degree of caution as well. I mean, they kept Jonah Hill, for instance, away from the first screening. They kept Michael Cera away from the first screening as well. And there were real genuine concerns over a couple of bits that might put people off, not least the swearing and the sheer amount of swearing in this high school film that's in its own way paying tribute to films like American Graffiti and Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which were clear influences and touch points acknowledged by Seth Rogen and Judd Apatow and by Evan Goldberg. But when they went before the test audience, no one batted an eyelid about the swearing. No one raised it as an issue. And so while they did a number of test screenings just to tune the film, that was never really anything that was a cause for concern. The studio didn't complain. The audience didn't complain. In fact, Rogen and Goldberg were already off doing their next project, Pineapple Express, by the time Superbad was ready for release as well. And that release was set for the summer of 2007. As it turned out, August the 17th, 2007 was when Superbad got its wide US release, having premiered just a few days before. The response to it as well was really charming, that as much as there's a lot of fairly crude and very potty mouth comedy in there, this heart that they were searching for, well, that clearly was coming across in the response to the film. That particularly the small story of friendship at the heart of it, that was being praised, and it was getting really good reviews in places you wouldn't necessarily expect a comedy of this ilk to get really good reviews. Would it then transfer to box office gold? Well, the answer to that one, a very firm yes. The weekend of August the 17th and 19th of 2007, Superbad opened in first place at the US box office with a $33 million opening weekend, a terrific start for the film, knocking Rush Hour 3 off the top of the chart. Also around was The Bourne Ultimatum and The Simpsons movie. The other big opener that weekend were Nicole Kidman and Daniel Craig in the latest remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Invasion, a very troubled production that. Perhaps I'll come to that one in a future episode of the podcast as well. And Superbad had the box office pretty much to itself. I mean, the following week out came Mr. Bean's Holiday and War and The Nanny Diaries, but it was Superbad that was still topping the chart. It lost only 45% of its business, added another 18 million in its second weekend. It was a Halloween film, Rob Zombie's Halloween film, that ultimately knocked it off the top slot. But other comedies were coming and not able to defenestrate it really. Balls of Fury came out. That didn't outgross it, didn't come close to outgrossing it. And Superbad hung around the chart for a long time. I mean, it was on release in the US for around 20 weeks in the end, banking $121 million at the American box office, travelling reasonably well for an American high school comedy as well, $49 million outside of the US. Worldwide gross, $170 million, and a very tidily profitable film, one whose reputation has endured. I mean, it's regarded as one of the finest high school comedies of the 2000s, even though there's been little bits of debate over it in the ensuing years. Seth Rogen, for one, chatted about it while he was promoting Neighbours 2 or Bad Neighbours 2 in 2016. And he admitted to The Guardian, he just said there are probably some jokes in Superman that are bordering on blatantly homophobic at times. He said they're all in the voice of high school kids who do speak like that. But I think we'd also be silly not to acknowledge that we were, to some degree, glamorising that type of language in a lot of ways. And so he's acknowledging the flaws, but also he does say it's a film he's really, really proud of, to the point where he's been one of those who's been resisting talk of a Superbad 2. That he once said that a sequel to Superbad is the one thing he would 100% probably never touch for any kind of further movie, and he talked about how proud he was of the film and how he doesn't want to sully it in any way. Now, not everybody is averse to a follow-up. Judd Apatow in particular has been keen to give it a go, chatting about it as recently as 2022. Jonah Hill said you'd need to wait till we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s or whatever to come up with the new story on it. Christopher Mintz-Plasse has said he would be interested in it, but if it was going forward now, it'd need to be a bit more female-centric than the first film. But the likelihood is that Superbad is just that. It is a one-film hit. And a real hit as well, a successful movie that had its genesis from two people when they were 14 years old who within, 10, 15 years had managed to get far enough away in Hollywood to be able to get the film made, get it over the line and turn it, with the help of an awful lot of other people, into a really successful and much-loved hit as well. Superbad then stands alone, and at the point of this is being recorded in June of 2023. There are no obvious signs of a Superbad 2 coming. Pineapple Express came out fairly soon afterwards, though, but that is a story for another episode of the podcast. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you for your time and thank you for listening. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're at Facebook, facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're on YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. And then there's our website, filmstories.co.uk, which is updated every weekday with movie news, features, reviews, all sorts of things there. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, that's where you can buy copies of our assorted print magazines and also our Sneakers Blu-ray that we made here in the UK with fresh extras on that too. And the Patreon again is patreon.com/Simon Brew. There are more live events coming up, but not until September. We do a few Film Stories live events throughout the year. I'll have more information on those in due course. For now, though, I'm just going to go off and watch another load of films. I hugely recommend you do the same. Most important thing, as always, is you all take care. You all look after yourselves. I'll be back soon with another bunch of Film Stories. Take care. Bye-bye.